Thank you very much. En Estados Unidos también se habla español. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros en esta coproducción de CNN y Univision. Thank you so much for being with us. And let me start with a little news. After nearly half a century in office, Fidel Castro resigned as the head of the Cuban government. 90 miles off the coast of the United States, we might have a new opportunity. The question for you, Senator Clinton, would you be willing to sit down with Raúl Castro or whoever leads the Cuban dictatorship when you take office, at least just once, to get a measure of the man?
Well, Jorge, I hope we have an opportunity. The people of Cuba deserve to have a democracy, and this gives the Cuban government under Raúl Castro a chance to change direction from the one that was set for 50 years by his brother. I'm going to be looking for some of those changes, releasing political prisoners, ending some of the oppressive practices on the press, opening up the economy. Of course, the United States stands ready, and as president, I would be ready to reach out and work with a new Cuban government once it demonstrated that it truly was going to change that direction. I want to bring the region together, our European allies who have influence with Cuba, to try to push for some of those changes and to make it very clear that if Cuba moves toward democracy and freedom for its people, the United States will welcome that. And as president, I would look for opportunities to try to make that happen and to create the momentum that might eventually lead to a presidential visit. But there has to be evidence that indeed the changes are real, that they're taking place, and that the Cuban people will finally be given an opportunity to have their future determined by themselves.
Very simply, would you meet with him or not, with Raúl Castro?
I would not meet with him until there was evidence that change was happening, because I think it's important that they demonstrate clearly that they are committed to change the direction. Then I think, something like diplomatic encounters and negotiations over specifics could take place. But we've had this conversation before, Senator Obama and myself, and I believe that we should have full diplomatic engagement where appropriate, but a presidential visit should not be offered and given without some evidence that it will demonstrate the kind of progress that is in our interests, and in this case, in the interests of the Cuban people.
And Senator Obama, just to follow up, you had said in a previous CNN debate that you would meet with the leaders of Cuba, Iran, North Korea, among others. So presumably you would be willing to meet with the new leader of Cuba.
That's correct. Now, keep in mind that the starting point for our policy in Cuba should be the liberty of the Cuban people. And I think we recognize that that liberty has not existed throughout the Castro regime. And we now have an opportunity to potentially change the relationship between the United States and Cuba after over half a century. I would meet without preconditions, although Senator Clinton is right that there has to be preparation. It is very important for us to make sure that there was an agenda, and on that agenda was human rights, releasing of political prisoners, opening up the press, and that preparation might take some time. But I do think that it is important for the United States not just to talk to its friends, but also to talk to its enemies. In fact, that's where diplomacy makes the biggest difference. And one other thing that I've said as a show of good faith, that we're interested in pursuing potentially a new relationship. What I've called for is a loosening of the restrictions on remittances from family members to the people of Cuba, as well as travel restrictions for family members who want to visit their family members in Cuba. And I think that initiating that change in policy as a start and then suggesting that an agenda gets set up is something that could be useful, but I would not normalize relations until we started seeing some of the progress that Senator Clinton was talking about.
But that's different from your position. Back in 2003, you called U.S. policy towards Cuba a miserable failure, and you supported normalizing relations. So you backtracked now.
I support the eventual normalization, and it's absolutely true that I think our policy has been a failure. I mean, the fact is that during my entire lifetime, and Senator Clinton's entire lifetime, you essentially have seen a Cuba that has been isolated, but has not made progress when it comes to the issues of political rights and personal freedoms that are so important to the people of Cuba. So I think that we have to shift policy. I think our goal has to be ultimately normalization. But that's going to happen in steps. And the first step, as I said, is changing our rules with respect to remittances and with respect to travel. And then I think it is important for us to have the direct contact, not just in Cuba, but I think this principle applies generally. I recall what John F. Kennedy once said, that we should never negotiate out of fear, but we should never fear to negotiate. And this moment, this opportunity when Fidel Castro has finally stepped down, I think is one that we should try to take advantage of.
Senator Clinton, do you want to quick response?
Well, I agree absolutely that we should be willing to have diplomatic negotiations and processes with anyone. I've been a strong advocate of opening up such a diplomatic process with Iran for a number of years, because I think we should look for ways that we can possibly move countries that are adversarial to us, toward the world community. It's in our interests. It's in the interests of the people in countries that, frankly, are oppressed, like Cuba, like Iran. But there has been this difference between us over when and whether the president should offer a meeting without preconditions with those with whom we do not have diplomatic relations. And it should be part of a process. But I don't think it should be offered in the beginning, because I think that undermines the capacity for us to actually take the measure of somebody like Raul Castro or Ahmadinejad and others. And as President Kennedy said, he wouldn't be afraid to negotiate, but he would expect there to be a lot of preparatory work done to find out exactly what we would get out of it. And therefore, I do think we should be eliminating the policy of the Bush administration, which has been very narrowly defined and frankly against our interests, because we have failed to reach out to countries, we have alienated our friends, and we have emboldened our enemies. So I would get back to very vigorous diplomacy, and I would use bipartisan diplomacy. I would ask emissaries from both political parties to represent me and our country, because I want to send a very clear message to the rest of the world that the era of unilateralism, preemption, and arrogance of the Bush administration is over, and we're going to start.
Okay, very briefly, and then we're going to move on.
I think, as I said before, preparation is actually absolutely critical in any meeting. And I think it is absolutely true that either of us would step back from some of the Bush unilateralism that's caused so much damage. But I do think it is important, precisely because the Bush administration has done so much damage to American foreign relations, that the president take a more active role in diplomacy than might have been true 20 or 30 years ago. Because the problem is if we think that meeting with the president is a privilege that has to be earned, I think that reinforces the sense that we stand above the rest of the world at this point in time. And I think that it's important for us, in undoing the damage that has been done over the last 7 years, for the president to be willing to take that extra step. That's the kind of step that I would like to take as president of the United States.
John King.
As Campbell noted, Senators, good evening. First, I want to bring the conversation back home. You know from your travels, you don't need to look at the polls or anything else, that the economy is by far now the dominant issue that voters want to hear about from the candidates. And for some, that's a question about what should we do about an economy that is at the edge or perhaps in the early stages of a recession. For some, it's more focused. Maybe it's, will you raise the minimum wage? Maybe it is about trade deals that they think leave them on the raw end, as you mentioned in your opening statement, Senator Obama. But when we ask Democrats, how are these two candidates different, many of them say they don't know. So, Senator Obama, beginning with you, tell us as specifically as you can, how would a President Obama be different than a President Clinton in managing the nation's economy?
Well, first of all, let me emphasize the point that you just made, which is you don't need an economist or the Federal Reserve to tell the American people that the economy is in trouble, because they've been experiencing it for years now. Everywhere you go, you meet people who are working harder for less. Wages and incomes have flatlined. People are seeing escalating costs of everything from health care to gas at the pump. And so people have been struggling for a long time, and in some communities, they have been struggling for decades now.